You're listening to WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You're listening to music local and sustainable, and I'm your host, Dave Lake. Tonight we're talking with Eric Jones, jazz composer and pianist.
There's one psychological theory of improvisation that says that you have a whole bunch of individual tools.
Yes.
And then the improvisation is selecting the appropriate tool for the appropriate sound you want.
Yeah. That's really true. That's really true. I think so. I think because it has to coalesce in order for it to turn into music. If not, it'll be more like practicing or exercising or you wondering. Of course, there are different types of improvisation. During the 60s, you had the free jazz. You had people like Cecil Taylor. But even with what Cecil Taylor was doing, it's still different components of the music. I guess for listeners, somebody say, well, Cecil Taylor just sounds like somebody just don't know what they're doing. But if you listen closely, you can hear certain things. I think one of the components to improvisation is the idea of repetition and contrast. Because even if you listen to like Keith Jarrett when he plays and he's improvising, he's working out ideas and he's going through the process. So that may take some of it may be repetition, taking a melody or taking a motive, which is part of a melody, and developing that into something. It's like you don't have all the answers yet, but you just keep investigating and you get to your destination, so to speak. And you utilize all of the different things, all of the different devices that you've learned. And then once you get to that point, you try to reach a part where you go into uncharted territory. That's where it really gets interesting, where you play beyond yourself. And a good example of that is if somebody said, man, I heard you did this or whatever, and you're like, I didn't know I did all of that. Or you hear yourself, you're like, is that me? Or because of the fact that you're trying to take yourself out of what you're doing, like what Kenny Werner talks about in Effortless Mastery. You kind of go into almost a trance-like state where you just let the music flow through you. And that's a combination of putting in the work, but also forgetting everything that you've learned. So.
Is improvisational playing innate, or is it teachable?
That's a tough question. I think it's teachable, but the problem is, one of the things people don't understand is everybody is not going to sound alike. And there's different levels to improvisation. I mean, I don't know how many times I had somebody say, man, can you teach me how to play like you? I'm like, I can't teach you how to play like me. It's like language. You learn the language, but you have to learn how to express yourself. You have to express your thoughts. And I think when it comes to improvisation, you learn different types of languages, for whether it's jazz improvisation, even classical improvisation, or just new age or whatever you want to call it. But you learn the language. So you can learn how to improvise, but you're probably going to end up sounding like yourself. And there's different degrees of improvisation. So that's one of the reasons why I said, when I heard Oscar Peterson and Art Tatum, I had to come to a decision and say I could chase this train for the rest of my life and I wouldn't be fulfilled, because I'm trying to sound like them. I'm trying to transcribe everything. I'm trying to work on the technique to that point where I can sound like them, and where somebody say, oh, you sound like Oscar Peterson. Well, one of the rules in jazz is the fact that if somebody say you sound like somebody, then you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You have to find your own voice. So I knew that I couldn't sound like them. What I can do is take things that they do and take certain things that I really like, incorporate it, and learn the language, but not be a model of what they're doing, So it is both innate, but it can be teachable too.
I was talking to Jody Espina, and he was saying the hardest thing for him when he's talking to young performers, in this case saxophone or clarinet, is to let themselves go.
Yeah.
Is to get away from the detail of the tools.
Yes.
And let themselves go and express themselves using the tools.
Yep.
But in an expressive way, not a cognitive way.
Yes. That's a tough one, because to me, I think when it comes to improvisation music, particularly in jazz, it's a marriage between the cerebral and the heart. And as musicians, especially as young musicians, and speaking as myself, sometimes we get caught up in the cerebral part of it because we're learning, we're just getting information. And then also I think part of it is the fact that we're trying to impress each other instead of come from a sincere place. So if you get to a point where you're starting to write music or even play music and stuff like that, you want to grow, and that's all good. When it comes time to play in front of a group of people, you have a responsibility to give them a piece of yourself. And how do you do that? You get out of the way. Stop trying to be cognitive. Just let it go and let it flow. And I think part of it is the idea of it's a form of intimacy, but it can be pretty scary when you get up there and you play in front of people and you're saying, "Here am I." It's like I'm giving myself to you, and you have to trust that. Look, what you're gonna sound like is what you're gonna sound like, and you're not gonna sound the same in each performances. There's so many different details or variations, different things that goes into that. You could be anything, and a lot of it's non-music related. And you just have to just say, look, I'm just gonna get out of my way. But it's easier said than done. I think as musicians we spend a lifetime of getting out of our ways. Speaking of improvisation, I'll do some free improvisation if you don't
Sure.
mind.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm gonna play, but we'll see what happens.
And you're only hearing it here.
All right.
nice. Very nice.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about composition, because you're an original composer. You have a lot of original music that you've written. What inspires you to write music?
I think life inspired me to write music. What normally happens is I either will have a melodic idea in my head, and sometimes it's away from the piano. And a lot of musicians, if they don't write it out or document it, it'll leave. But there's been times where it stayed in there and it just ruminates and stuff, and so it's like, I really need to write this out. And then improvising at the piano, sometimes I get inspiration from that. For me, also, just experiences too, just thinking about places I've been or places I want to go, traveling and stuff like that. Because the weird thing is, and I think a lot of composers can relate to this, is sometimes when they compose program music, and sometimes you compose a piece based on a place you see or a landscape or something like that. And so I feel like that's something that I think about when I'm playing too. If I'm composing music, even if I'm just doing free improvisation, I think of a place where I visit, maybe to the mountains, and it influenced the way I play. And so those are different inspirations for me.
Well, why don't we listen to an original piece?
Okay. So this particular piece is Por la Ciudad, has Spanish influence. Composed this about 4 years ago. So here it is.
What was the inspiration behind that?
Well, I'm gonna be honest. That was a musical inspiration. During that time when I wrote this, I was listening to a lot of Chick Corea, and of course, knowing Chick, Chick implies a lot of Spanish music and particularly flamenco music in a lot of his writings and stuff and his compositions. So when I remember just listening to it, and I was like, man, the idea just came out of something, maybe a germ of what I was listening to from him, and then I just started. I wrote it, and through the years, I kind of developed certain sections and made some changes to it. And, no two forms are the same, but it really comes out of that.
You mentioned that over the years you've made modifications. You don't play it the same way twice, but to get the original piece, how long did it take you to come up with that original piece?
I think when I first started, when I wrote it, I think it didn't take long for this one. Sometimes it depends on the circumstances. Some things I feel like I can just it'll come and I can get the entire song and I can write it out in one setting. Then sometimes it may be where I'm having to really work out some things and really logically go through some different ideas and construct something. In this particular case, that wasn't the case. I tell you what happened was when I wrote it, though, I made changes on it. One of the things I'm starting to realize is if I write something, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the finished product. What I have to do, because of what I write is improvisation, even some of the stuff that I wrote that wasn't improvisation, is when I hear it live and hear it in the context, I may have to make changes to it. And I'm starting to realize if I play it enough times and just play it, more ideas will come and better ideas will come, and it will replace certain ideas that I had when I initially wrote the music. And so sometimes that can be a long process. It kind of goes through a refining process, basically.
Now, when you originally came up with it, you sat down and notated it.
Sometimes what I do is, and I think in this case, I played it and recorded it, and then I transcribed it and notated it that way.
Now, do you re-notate it every time you come up with a new version?
Not necessarily. Sometimes I make changes, depends on the instrumentation. So if there's some technical things that for a particular instrument that I say, okay, well, that it's an easier way to write that, I may re-notate it. Or I may change the melody to fit the limitations of the instrument.
Let me take a piece that I've only heard actually as a quartet, I think it was. Okay. My Homage.
Oh, yeah.
Do you work that out initially at the keyboard?
I worked that out at the keyboard. A lot of times a song like that it starts here, and a lot of times it'll stay in my head and I'll work it out in my head, and then sometimes I sit at the piano and start working out some different ideas. And it's not a linear thing. Sometimes I may start in the middle of the piece, or maybe at the beginning, or maybe at the end. Sometimes I don't even know which one is beginning or the end. It's just all the different components. And then when I start to sit at the piano and put it together, that's when it's like, okay, let's connect those components and try to make it into a homogeneous song. And I think that particular piece, I took the melody, the opening melody, I had the melody, but the other parts I didn't have, the B section or different sections of the piece. So I had to sit down and go through some different variations on some ideas that I could incorporate.
Now, once you've worked it out, so you work out the initial melody, you work out, say, a B portion, it's contrasting.
Yeah.
Do you then take it to other musicians and start working with them, or do you work out all the parts first?
I try to work out all the parts first. If I get an opportunity to play the music with musicians, then I start to make some changes. Depends on the guys that I'm playing with, what instrumentation. Because initially, sometimes when I write, I usually have an idea of what instrumentation that I want, and I just write it for those instruments. But then sometimes I just write it for piano and then have to change it. But once I bring it to a band, I'm like, okay, this is what I got. What do you guys think? There's a level of freedom that you can have with the music and stuff like that. You got any better ideas? Because I'm always trying to learn from the people that I'm playing with, especially when you're writing for their instruments. I mean, it makes you a better writer. I try to say, okay, here it is. And then, like I think I mentioned earlier, sometimes if we got to do this, or this is a lick that we got to do, or something we got to play, there's a structure that's part of the structure, so we can't make changes to that, but try to negotiate room to make some changes if need to be.
And then at that point, do you chart it, or do you bring charts to your initial group?
I'll bring it to them. I bring the charts to them, and that's when we'll talk about it or play it and see what they think. And if they say, okay, man, that's not going to work, that's when I have to kind of rechart it again. In some pieces, there's different versions of them too. I had a piece that I wrote. It was in like 7, and at one point it was in cut time. And I got 2 versions of it. And sometimes I base that on the people that I'm playing with, because some people, not all musicians feel comfortable playing in odd meters. So it's like I want to play this piece so bad. I better write a version of it where we don't have to have that as a stumbling block. But I can play a little bit
sure.
of it.
Can you play it in a little bit of both versions?
Yeah. So the one that I've been playing was the one that's not in 7. Here's one of them, a sample of it. So that kind of has a more of a Latin type of flavor to it. This one is in the odd meter, so it's a little different. Let me see. I'm gonna do my best to play this one. I haven't played this version in a while. So it's a little different, and that's the one that if I were to record it, I'd probably be more on the more of an adventurous side of it, which I consider that more the adventurous version of it. So that's the one I would want to record. Of course, I have to practice it.
It's been a great pleasure to me. I can't tell you how much I've really enjoyed this and how much I've learned.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. I had a great time. I love talking about good music. I just just music in general. I just love good conversation too. So it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you so very much.
Yeah.
This has been another edition of Music Local and Sustainable, and I've been your host, Dave Lake. Save this time for another show next week.
Well, I know we ain't headed for the Hall of Fame. Gonna give it what we got, man, that ain't no shame. Let me know if you can hear me. Check, 1, 2. Let me know if you can hear me. Check, 1,